I think this is a good opportunity for bipartisan support in this country because this is one of the few environmental issues where really it's the liberals that are against a form of clean energy and conservatives are for that form of clean energy. And
that's why we're pretty happy about what the Biden administration has said, at least,
yes.
and what the DOE has said.
Yes.
Now, things one thing, we hope to have some type of actual legislation that says these plants don't need to close down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's really no reason to, unless the NRC says so.
For those of you watching this, please respectfully, because this topic can get a little heated, respectfully, please let me know what you think about nuclear in the comments below. Hey everyone, it's Becky here from the Beckisphere, and welcome to my channel where we talk about climate change news and solutions. And today we have Mickey with me. He's been in my videos a couple times. Mickey, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, I'm Mickey, as Becky had mentioned. I'm here to talk about nuclear power. I've been a nuclear advocate for a couple years on the side, but currently in the Illinois area.
What is your background of experience?
I don't have a technical background in nuclear power or anything along those lines, but I do have a background in environmental science.
The first question I have for you then is, why should we care about nuclear power? Like, why is it a good form of clean energy?
For those who don't know, currently nuclear power, at least here in the US, provides about 55% of your clean energy currently. So right there makes a huge impact on which way we want to go and, produce electricity for your houses and your towns and your cities. In an overall sense, nuclear power produces, large amounts of reliable, resilient electric power. And it also has a minimal land impact, a minimal mineral impact, and a minimal life cycle carbon emissions impact. Nuclear power only uses uranium for mining. That's it. All the other building materials are your concrete and your steel along those lines. According to the EIA, options like offshore wind, solar have a much larger impact on minerals being mined. If we look at something like minerals being mined and their carbon emissions, you will also see that nuclear has a minimal impact in that sense. There's a good chart, which I'm sure you'll show, from Scientific American, which shows that the amount of minerals cut from things like solar or wind use a much larger amount, and those really increase your emissions. And so that all involves in your life cycle. And that's why when you look at that, there's no doubt saying nuclear is the smarter choice here if you are concerned about the impact and the land impact. And also, I think people have to remember that all energy resources, to keep it simple, use some type of minimal, the minerals, the critical earths, you can't get away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's the case for pretty much any form of clean energy generation. They all start with initial building emissions and mining. So that's true. It sounds great. Why do people have problems with nuclear energy then?
Mainly, it really boils down to misinformation. I think some people are being disingenuous, for sure, when they have a different agenda. But most people are just either not informed or misinformed. I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, for the most part in conversations.
Okay, so to be a little contrarian, so one of the arguments that people have against nuclear is the nuclear waste that it creates.
All the nuclear fuel waste that we've used decades before, so all in history, can fit in a football field 10 to 12 meters high, which is really, when you look at it, that's nothing. That's the minimal. The fact that you can store all the waste in one location should be amazing to people. I very much argue that nuclear has the best, I guess you want to call it, waste control system of most, if not majority, of all the energy sources.
And then also that waste could possibly be reused.
One of the things we do, and we've started to do here in nuclear advocacy, is we don't refer to the waste as waste, because really that's kind of, it's a mislabeling, because all the nuclear waste that you see in the dry cast, usually on site, are solid pellets. And they should be really more accurately referred to as reusable fuel to be used. And so basically they can be put in some of these newer reactors and be, reused, so it becomes a closed cycle.
Gotcha. What is the percent energy that you can get from the waste compared to the initial nuclear energy production?
So you only, I don't know the percentage offhand. I don't have that number in front of me, but it's 2 to 5% initially that we pull from the uranium. But when we reuse it in reactors that are referred to as breeder or fast reactors, we can just continue to use that fuel until it's exhausted or close to it. You can also, besides storing it, and before you reuse in a reactor, you do what is called reprocessing. So you can convert it into reusable fuel. Here in the US, we don't do it just because we haven't. It's a little expensive, and our regulatory system does not allow for it. But places like France reprocesses their nuclear fuel. It's really comes down to having the ability to do so and the type of reactor to make it in effective manner. That's why most waste currently is just stored in the dry cast.
Another argument that people have against nuclear is the time it takes to build a reactor. That was one of my main arguments when I was initially not for nuclear, because I didn't think that it made any sense to build a new reactor because of how long it would take to do so. That we just don't have the time.
Well, it is a very common one, especially if you look at the US. We haven't built a new reactor, somebody will correct me, but I don't think we haven't built a new reactor basically since the 70s, or early 80s. And when you try to build a reactor for the first time, you have, just individuals and companies and groups who have not encountered those problems. They don't know the workflow or how to, what works and what doesn't. So here in the US, that's why you see the project like Vogtle is taking 10 years, because we have one company, or the companies that are working on it, basically building a reactor for the first time. The time really is a US centered thing. If you look internationally, in Korea, China, Russia, those areas, they're building reactors within a 5-year time span. That's great. And that's ultimately is on par with other new sources being built.
Another argument is that if they are near an earthquake fault, that citizens around the nuclear reactor are at risk. But there's been a couple meltdowns that have freaked people out. So can you talk a little bit on why that would not be a problem? I know that that's a main argument for getting rid of the Diablo one in California, is that they found it was on a fault line.
That comes case. So when nuclear reactors are built, and I'm going to keep it very basic, they take into account the surrounding environment, at least for the most part. I don't know the details of how active that fault is in Diablo, but that reactor has been running for some time and has not encountered any problems. I know certain reactors, if they are built to that location, and that's a real potential issue, there is built-in buffers basically within the reactor build. I think the other one you were referring to was Fukushima. And
yeah, I mean, that one's kind of different. I mean, there was a tsunami involved partially, but
to what you were referring to, because an earthquake happened, and most people refer that when they talk about that hazard. But that reactor was built in mind, but not for that intensity of a earthquake. Really, that comes down to you can never predict what your environment is going to throw you if it comes to the extreme. So you build for what you know.
True. But that's why some people would argue not in my backyard, right?
And
Because
most people are not. You're never going to actually build a reactor on an active fault line. There hasn't been a reactor that's on a fault line that's like super active, that's going to like shake every couple of years or huge every couple of years. I'm assuming, and don't quote me on this, but Diablo 1, that fault line is not very active.
okay, so those are some of the main arguments against nuclear reactors. So that being the case, we have explored a couple different reasons of why people might be shutting down those nuclear reactors or cutting their leases. Which reactors should we be worrying about right now?
In terms of closing?
Yeah.
I think the big one right now, besides the Illinois plants, Byron and Dresden, right now it's really more of a political football being played with. That's a very complicated issue because the lawmakers, it's in their hands to decide. We're going to try to do everything we can to not close those plants. The other one is, as you mentioned, Diablo. That's been closed by politics. And offhand, I don't know how much we can do to turn that around, to keep it open. California is going to need that plant open. With the increased, heat wave, electricity use, things like the renewables not completely online like they would like them to, they need that extra 2 gigs of reliable power.
Did we touch on already a little bit about the other forms of clean energy being they're more variable than nuclear power, because nuclear power doesn't rely on the wind blowing or the sun shining.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's kind of a false thing to compare nuclear versus wind and solar. Because nuclear does produce power on almost day and night. You don't have it's there, it's on, it's producing, and you need a minimum amount of space to produce that large amount of power. Wind and solar really produce a smaller amount of power. The capacity factors are different, and it's really for a different purpose. It fits that space of time that you may need to meet that peak, or when storage happens, it can fill in that gap of time maybe.
Yeah, and that's another argument for nuclear, is that nuclear is already in a developed stage, and battery storage and energy storage still has a little ways to go to become actually, industry ready. So we need something until at least batteries or energy storage gets better.
With batteries, you'd really still need nuclear. Particularly, nuclear has been shown to be the quickest way to decarbonize, and even more so if you add it to the solar, wind, battery setup that people like to support.
There are also some states who have restrictions on building new nuclear plants. Can you talk a little bit about which states those are and what those restrictions are?
Yeah. But 3/4 of states have some type of moratorium or ban. And those bans regard everything from just building a new nuclear plant outright to issues like waste disposal, or just legislative approval. And many times those things are very hard to jump through in terms of a hoop, so they just are not being built there. That may change as the industry changes.
Do you think the industry is heading towards nuclear, or do you think there's a lot of pushback and that it's going to continue to decline?
Globally, it's growing. There's a new reactor being built and put online every couple of years, which is great. Here in the US, we face a lot more issues. Besides misinformation by people, which happens, and which is almost too large of an issue, then you just have politics in itself. That's a huge driver in a lot of these bans, or at least not even wanting to entertain the idea. Kind of like New York. it was clearly a political move, because recently they just said, hey, we are strongly supporting our clean energy goals. It's like, well, you just failed by closing the nuclear plant and allowing more fossil fuels to be built and imported into your state.
Mm.
So I would say that's the biggest thing. But when it comes to, I guess, the current administration and the DOE, they've said, hey, nuclear's got to be it. Otherwise, we're never going to reach our goals. And that's a fact. I hope more states become, a little more open to it. Mm-hmm. And some states are more open to it with some of the smaller reactors, which are in licensing currently.
Okay, that brings us into the next thing too. What are some up and coming either renovations to current reactors or developing of new reactors that might make people feel more comfortable having a nuclear reactor neighbor?
You should always have a nuclear plant neighbor, always. I highly recommend it. I guess one thing to mention before I talk about some new stuff and stuff we should watch is that the current reactors in our fleet, the large reactors, they are not old and decrepit. They do get updates. They do get retrofitted. And so they're running fine. There's no age to be retired. Duke Energy, I think they are, they just licensed one of their reactors for 80 years. And that's going to be the new standard for all our current reactors. And we'd love to see all the current large reactors licensed to that amount. That would take us through any type of deadline we have for CO2 emissions. And throughout that time, we'll be able to build new reactors. If you are looking for new projects, limit this to the US, because there are a lot of other projects internationally which you can look up outside of the Vogtle plant, which is the only large reactor being built here in the US. There are a couple small reactors, there's a couple in the national labs and a couple private ones. And both of those are small modular reactors. And this is, some people like to call it a fad, but it is really where the technology is going for many new investors. One of the ones you can look at is the TVA, which is the Tennessee Valley Authority SMR, small modular reactor. It is a light water reactor, very similar design to our current reactors. That is in development. So that is something to watch. Then you also have
smaller better.
It's better in terms of appearance for some people. It is better in terms of portability. But it's also, some people, for their concerns, it lessens their concern. Mm-hmm. It also can be put in other places, maybe more isolated places or localized places where they don't need 1 gigawatt of power. Maybe they need only about 300 megawatts of power or something, in that range. But that is one project. Argonne National Lab here in Chicago is doing development and research on portable reactors. And so those are the ones going to be on emergency locations in semis. So we can, if you have a natural disaster, you got to get power quickly, you drive it down, you plug it in, it's producing power for everybody. It's very similar to the idea of the floating reactors, where you can take them to a port, plug them in, power the town. The two big ones that everybody watches are 2 reactors that are non-light water reactors. So they don't use water as a coolant. So these are molten salt reactors. They use salt, and they are fast reactors. So they can use the waste or the reusable fuel that we currently have. And so there are 2 of them. There is the Oklo Aurora nuclear plant, and it is more of a micro reactor, but it's in between micro and small modular, but it is small. Mm-hmm. And it is currently being, it's through licensing right now, and it's going to be at the Idaho National Lab, if I'm not mistaken. And it will be a reactor that is housed and integrated with solar panels on its building.
Wow, that's cool.
Yes, and the design for the building is a very appealing building, like it fits into the landscape. So that's another one of those things. It's easier to do with a smaller reactor, is kind of that appearance. The other one to look at, and what was most recently in the news, is Bill Gates' TerraPower Natrium reactor design. And this one's very interesting because it's basically a closed cycle almost. And it's integrated energy system. So the natrium nuclear reactor uses regular nuclear fuel, but it also has an on-site storage unit with it. So you have the combined use. And so they're hoping that having that combination lowers costs and also adds something to the grid.
Is there any particular timeline for any of those that you can recall?
I think the Oklo Aurora would like to be running, at least for that plant, in mid-2020, early 30s. So within 5 years, they hope. The Natrium, they'd like a very same timeline, but they still need to get licensing. I think they have a much easier site to deal with because they want to reproduce a whole plant. And then the other ones, again, are in development. Who knows? But all the more reason to keep our current reactors. Have those reactors running, understand what they give to society and to the electric grid, and just promote them, to continue that operation.
How can people get involved? How can they help either change the trajectory of a reactor around them from getting closed down, or help encourage new reactors to be built, or current ones to continue getting funding?
Contact your legislator. It's the biggest thing. If they hear from people, they will listen, especially if you call them. When there is any type of anti-nuclear stuff, do educate yourself. That's the best thing to do. There is a couple good sites to look at, and then you can join generationatomic.org, which is I'm part of, and we advocate and educate nuclear power across the United States and globally.
I think this is a good opportunity for bipartisan support in this country, because this is one of the few environmental issues where really it's the liberals that are against a form of clean energy and conservatives are for that form of clean energy. And
that's why we're pretty happy about what the Biden administration has said, at least,
yes,
and what the DOE has said.
Yes.
Now, things one thing, we hope to have some type of actual legislation that says these plants don't need to close down. There's really no reason to, unless the NRC says so.
Well, potentially they can get more money from an infrastructure package.
One of the ideas that has been tossed around is do something like, if a carbon price doesn't get enacted, do something like the wind and solar have, the investment tax credit or production tax credit, whatever it is, or a zero emissions credit like many states do, and incorporate that for all of the plants in the United States, which would do them a lot of good.
Well, is there any other points having to do with nuclear that you don't think we have touched on yet that you want to make sure gets covered?
I'd say if you have questions about nuclear, more than anything, do a little bit of research before you get on the bandwagon. A lot of the issues and a lot of concerns for people are concerns. They're understandable. But once you understand the risk and the comparative benefits of nuclear for both your community, for the reduction of pollution and carbon emissions, and the land impact, you almost have to default to supporting nuclear.
With that being said, I think this is where we're going to stop it for today. But for those of you watching this, please respectfully, because this topic can get a little heated, respectfully, please let me know what you think about nuclear in the comments below. Also, let me know if there's any reactors around you. Thank you so much for talking with me, Mickey, about this important issue.
Well, thank you for having me.
And I'm sure we'll see you at some point soon again on the Beckisphere. Thanks for coming.
We'll talk about something else. Yes.
We'll talk about something else. Exactly. All right. Bye.